All right, so this is about half peer review and half publishing. So the first half of it is the questions that I got submitted from people, and then the other half is just a bit of a presentation I've given on publishing in the past. So let's see. All right, so just to give you guys an idea, and you know, my guys probably know, but even so, what my experience on publishing and reviewing and editing is. So I've published almost 100 articles, virtually all of them in journals. Only a handful, I think like maybe 5 were book chapters. About a quarter of them were either first or solo authored papers. So the first authored papers, you know, almost all when I was a grad student or postdoc. The solo authored papers were more ones I wrote once I became a professor, because in an anthro department, they just really like to see your name at the beginning of the list. So I did some solo authored papers for that. And then almost half of them last authored, which, you know, in my field in genetics indicates that, you know, I'm the head of the lab sort of driving the research program. A lot of different journals, 50 journals. I was kind of surprised by that, which tells you I don't publish in the same journal over and over again. And that more is a reflection of just collaborating with a lot of people. You know, so a lot of those journals that I only publish in a single time are papers in which I'm a middle author. So, you know, there's a whole string of malaria journals that one of my grad students was publishing in, or collaborations where, you know, they're journals where I don't typically publish. I've not ever written a book. You know, books just aren't common in genetics. I really don't have any plans to write a book. So I've been associate editor for 4 different journals, for AJPA, for the Yearbook of Phys Anthro, for Molecular Biology and Evolution, MBE, and for Paleo America. For Paleo America, I'm like the token geneticist. I'm supposed to drum up genetics papers and cover the review of any genetics papers come in. So when I add up the years I've done all of that, it's over 20 years as associate editor. I've never been an editor, to be quite honest. I don't think I want to be. All right, so that's where my experience for all of this comes from. So the question, this first one came from Chu. As an editor, how thoroughly should I be reading each manuscript I'm assigned? So I will say I do not typically read the entire manuscript if I'm assigned it as an editor. I figure my job is to send it out to review. So I'll read the abstract and the introduction to make sure that the manuscript should actually be sent out for review, and also to get ideas for reviewers. So I'll see in the introduction the papers that they're citing, and see if, you know, some of those papers the authors of those papers would be, you know, the best people to review the paper. And then, so what I usually try to do is pick one reviewer that the authors have suggested, and then pick one reviewer myself. So when I'm doing this little, you know, quick read of the manuscript, if there are any red flags, like if the manuscript seems somehow sketchy, that the authors, you know, like the writing is just kind of off, or if I'm confused, all right? So I use that as an indicator. If I can't figure out what they're talking about, then I assume other people are going to have trouble figuring it out, and that's not what you want. So if it's confusing, or if I don't feel like the conclusions are supported, if they're really kind of overstating what they found, then I'll go in for a deeper read. You know, then I'll, you know, start reading more so that I can figure out which way I want to go with it. Do I want to reject it without review? Do I want to send it back to the authors? And what I've done in recent years is if something's just poorly written, I don't want to send it out for review, because if it's so poorly written that I think it's really hard to understand what the authors have done, I will often send it back to the authors at that point and just say that I think the writing is really impeding the understanding and appreciation for what they've done. And before I send it out for review, I'd like them to improve the writing a little bit, you know, and I'm sure authors are often pissed off at that. but I don't feel like it's worth wasting people's time to ask them to review a manuscript that I think the author should have worked harder at. But that's, that's after a lot of years of doing this, that I've started taking that perspective. I will say that the criteria or the bar I set for whether I send something out for review and whether I ultimately accept it is impacted by the impact factor of the journal. So in other words, I reject a lot more articles for MBE than I do for AJPA because MBE has a much higher impact factor and a much higher reject rate. So then after I get the reviews back, I check the reviews with the article to make sure that, the reviews are fair and accurate, and, then I make my decision. But I guess this is a long-winded way of saying, like I said, I do not read the entire article unless there are reasons why, I would start doing that. But for the vast majority of articles, I don't feel like I need to read the whole thing to send it out for review and then evaluate the reviews. Okay, how many rounds of review is common? Do papers go to the same reviewer? So I would say 2 to 3 rounds of review are typical for me. And the last round is often just small changes to make sure that the paper is really perfect. Oftentimes reviewers will make comments, but as an editor, I also will, to tell them to change the wording on their title. I really don't like any kind of typos or any grammatical errors in the abstract. That to me just screams that, you haven't been very careful. So, after the authors have taken care of the vast majority of, sort of fundamental issues with a manuscript, I'll still make sure that, little nitpicky things are also seen to. And so the third round might just be that little stuff. I've never seen a paper, accepted after 1 round, like you send it out for review and both reviewers say, oh, it looks great. Can't think of anything I want them to change. That's never happened. I did go 4 rounds with one student's paper where I was a co-author, and I went 4 rounds with a paper as a reviewer. And I will tell you, they were both incredibly frustrating experiences. Sometimes authors don't listen or respond to the reviewers. That's why you've got 4 rounds. They're really not doing what the reviewers are asking. And when I was a reviewer and went 4 rounds, I really felt like they were wanting me to rewrite the paper for these authors because it was badly written. And I kept saying, it's badly written. You need to, they were non-English speakers, but that wasn't even it. It just wasn't a well-organized, well-written paper. And I was really surprised how long the editor stuck with it because I was ready to throw in the towel, but it ultimately was accepted. And yes, ideally you want the same reviewers to see the paper for all the rounds of review. And usually people will do that unless, something has happened to them from the first time they reviewed it that, they're no longer able to review it. Oftentimes with the second round of review, I may only send it to 1 reviewer if I think, it looks like, the authors did pretty much everything they were asked. I'll send it to the reviewer who had the most extensive list of changes to make.
Could I ask a question about that slide, Dr. Mulligan?
Yep.
Could you tell us, like, what is the fastest, sort of in terms of like months or weeks or whatever, that you've seen papers go through the review process? So like, what is the fastest sort of 2-round review paper, and how long did those 4 rounds of reviews for those papers take? Like, are we talking about 2 months and 8 months, or like 2 months and a year? Like, what's the time range here?
So I would say I would say both the papers with the 4 rounds, it was a year or more, from the first submission to when it was accepted. And I've seen the gamut. I've asked people to review a paper where they say yes, and I've got the review by the end of the day. That is by far, not typical. And particularly with COVID, everything has gotten so long. I mean, when I pull up my AJPA page that I'm AE for all these papers, I've got all this red, you know, review late by 27 days, review late by, you know, 36 days, review late by 9. I mean, so many people are late these days. And, you know, I mean, so I nag less these days because my bar is now, it's like, oh, that's only 2 weeks late. I'm not even going to bother contacting you. I would say, and journals are different. MBE wants the reviews returned in 2 weeks. And they really mean 2 weeks. It's not just like, gosh, we'd really be happy if you get it back in 2 weeks. They'll start nagging you and me. Whereas AJPA, I don't know, it's 3 weeks, it's 4 weeks. We kind of just keep sending reminders. Like all of the platforms, I'm pretty sure, does it do it for our journal that they automatically send out reminders for reviews after 2 weeks or something?
I think it sends, if I'll have to look at the settings, I think it sends one reminder, because you have to request someone in the system first and see if they'll accept the assignment. And then if they don't respond within 2 weeks, it sends them, I think, one reminder email that, hey, you need to either accept or decline this job. And then you set the date for like when the review is due. And I think it sends them a reminder email. I think it sends them one. I don't know if it sends them any more than that after a while. It might only send them maybe one reminder, but I'd have to check on it. But it does send, to some point, some automatic reminders.
We have to set the 2 week one. Oh, sorry, we have to send the 2 week one, like your review is due in 2 weeks. It doesn't automatically do that, but it does have a template for it. So you can just like pull from the drop-down menu, click it, and hit send to reviewer. No,
but I mean that, like, if they're overdue.
Yeah.
Does it automatically send one?
I don't know. I don't think so.
It does. I think it sends one. I think it sends one if they're overdue, but I don't know that it sends that preemptively.
It'd be good to automate that as much as possible, because I think for AJPA, I think, like you said, when you ask someone to review, I think it prompts them maybe 2 times to, you know, accept or decline. And then once they agree to review, it sends a reminder. And then I think it sends at least 2 reminders after they're late, and they all get copied back to the associate editor. So you're aware that, you know, oh, someone's late or someone hasn't responded. But so Edward, to get back to your question, you know, it really varies. You know, I nag. I like, if I see that one of those automated reminders has gone out, I will often then send a personal email. And what I try to do is I try to say, you know, I'm sure you're really busy, but your review is now 7 days late. Do you think you'll be able to get to it by the end of this week? I always give them some sort of deadline, you know, that's like several days away, because I found that that helps people, you know, say, yeah, Connie, I'll get to it. I promise by the end of the week, you know, something like that. But I haven't really found any magic bullets, particularly in these COVID days. People are just so busy. There's no magically worded email that I've found that, you know, really gets people to send in a review. Instead, I've gotten to the point where I'm like, oh, wow, I got 1 review. I've only got 12 missing, you know. So it goes on quite long, you know, and I don't know any more to say than that. You know, if something gets really excessive, you know, typically I can get people to turn in their reviews if they're late. But things are so different now with COVID. There are people that I've just flat up given up on. People who you know, accepted, you know, the review and even got back to me once or twice, say, oh yeah, I'll get to it. And then, you know, I mean, we're like 90 days or something, right? And so at some point I take a hint and I get a new reviewer for that article. Sam.
So when you do get the reviews back, is there ever an instance where you feel that the comments made about a paper are unreasonable? And if so, what do you do with that? Do you just get a replacement reviewer? Do you pick some comments and not others?
So I've got a slide that's better
Oh, okay.
focused on that. So can you bring that up again when I get to the slide if I don't remember?
Yeah.
So that we can have a whole discussion on reviewers' comments?
Mhm.
Okay. Oh, maybe this is it. How should editors handle conflicting reviewer comments? And that's sort of what you were getting at, you know, conflicting or overly demanding. So if you've got two reviews and they're contradictory, you know, one says reject and the other, you know, tends to like it, then get a third review. You know, you, in that situation, you would really like to not have to make the decision yourself, but you'd like to have a third review sort of break the tie. If you've got 3 reviews and 2 go one way and the other goes the other way, then at that point you should have enough information to make the decision yourself. If not, you could consider getting a 4th review, though that seems excessive to me. I think at that point, you know, discuss it with the board, you know, and let's make the decision that way. And then in that case where you've got those sort of contradictory reviews, as the associate editor, you need to make it clear to the authors what on those reviews they have to pay attention to. So you're going to make a decision and you are going to, you know, essentially say, I'm not that worried about these reviews here. I'm going with, you know, these other reviews here. So you kind of have to make that clear, and you don't say, you know, I really don't agree with reviewer number 1. I think reviewers 2 and 3 got it right. Instead, focus on their comments, right? Like if reviewer 1 wanted all these additional analyses, you can either not address that, or you can say, you know, I don't really feel these analyses are necessary, you know, for this paper. And that will get across to the author that you're not that concerned with the points that reviewer's bringing up. But then do list the things you want the author to do, and that ought to make it clear which reviewers, you know, suggestions you think are really important. And so similarly, Sam, if you think a reviewer is just asking for too much, you know, like I said, I would say something like, I don't really feel these analyses are necessary for, you know, this paper, or, you know, I think the authors worked really hard, you know, with the limited sample size. I don't think, you know, collecting additional samples is necessary. You know, I would probably say something like that. So address it, but not, you know, not engage it in gory depth or anything, you know, just make it clear to the author that, you know, you don't have to worry about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so how much time should you be spending on a review? So if you're the reviewer now, not the editor, the reviewer, so you've got to read the whole manuscript thoroughly, maybe even more than once, depending on how familiar you are with that field and the methods and all that kind of stuff. I concentrate on the results and conclusions to make sure that the results make sense and that the conclusions are supported. Obviously, if the manuscript's outside of your field, you're going to need more time to read it and think about the review. And then you want to write a thorough review that has a lot of specific feedback to improve the manuscript. And you want to be supportive, not overly critical, not nasty. You know, if there's stuff you don't agree with, you don't just say, oh, you know, this wasn't done right or whatever. Say what you want them to do instead, you know. So it might take you, you know, since you're new reviewers, new editors, as reviewers, it might take you 5 to 10 hours to read a manuscript and write the review. I tend to, you know, when I write my review, I always let it sit overnight before I submit it so that I can read it again the next day and, you know, make some final changes and stuff. I try to limit myself to about 2 to 3 hours, you know, for reading and writing, because, you know, I've got a better idea of, you know, what I'm doing. And I never agree to review stuff that's outside of my field, because I mean, that just takes too much of my time. You want experts to review papers, and if I feel I'm not an expert, I'm going to decline. I do not redo analyses. I think we talked about that some people have actually, you know, some reviewers have requested whole data sets so they can redo the analyses, and I'm just always kind of blown away that people have the time to do that, because I do not do that. I'll look over the statistics and the results and make sure that, you know, it all makes sense. You know, most often what I see happens is that people have results that they report and they're not statistically significant. And, you know, I mean, it's shown that they're not statistically significant, but then they're talking about these results. And I think, you know, that shouldn't even be mentioned. I mean, statistically insignificant, why, you know, don't even talk to me about statistically insignificant results. And I also don't do extensive, you know, rewriting, like if it's just, you know, typos, grammar, English, stuff like that. I don't do that, though some people do. You know, they'll submit a PDF where, you know, they've made all extensive edits, or, you know, they'll have maybe pages of just line edits. And I think that's great if somebody's willing to take that time. I don't do that. You know, I don't feel that's my role. Okay, so how do you track the time that you spend as a reviewer or as an editor, and, you know, how does it count? So being an associate editor of a journal or a manuscript reviewer counts as service, but it doesn't count as much, unfortunately. Really, only an editor counts as an actual administrative position that could possibly get you time off teaching or something as a faculty member. Associate editor and reviewer, I don't know, I think it typically gets listed as like 5% of my time on my annual activities report, which is not very much. It's often mentioned in the chair's annual letter, like Pete writes a letter for all of us, and I'm always sort of amazed when some people's letters say, oh, and you provided the review of one manuscript this year, because I think reviewing one manuscript as a, you know, professor is pretty pathetic. That you ought to be doing a lot more reviewing than that. But even if you don't get credit for it, it's still important to do, because you learn a lot about writing and submitting and publishing papers. I'm convinced you become a better writer, and you just get, you get better at publishing papers, and you just learn a lot that, you know, maybe informs your research. And furthermore, I do think, you know, we're beholden to this whole peer review system. So, you know, you could do a loose calculation and say that every person ought to review as many papers as their papers have had reviews of. So you get what I'm saying? So I remember reviewing, we had one of our full professors at UF up for the rank above full professor. I don't know what it is. We don't have very many of them, but, you know, it's not where they retire and are, you know, emeritus, but it's something higher than that. And so he was in chemistry, and he published about 20 papers a year. And he said he assumed that each paper had about 3 reviews before it got published. So he felt a responsibility to review as many as that. So he did about 50 to 60 reviews a year, which, in other words, that's like 1 a week, which blew me away and made me feel, you know, really kind of like a slacker, because I try to do as many reviews as I think people review my papers, but I don't think I quite hit that number. Okay, so Chu said that for one of the papers you're overseeing, the author submitted a revised manuscript in the middle of the review process. So you can't do that, all right? I don't know the details of it. I don't know if it was like the day after it had been submitted, you know, somebody realized they uploaded the wrong version, which, I mean, okay, you know, hopefully you haven't already sent it out. And I mean, I don't even know that you can't, I don't even know how you can submit a new version. I thought the system gets like closed once you've submitted it. But if you've already sent the manuscript out for review, then you can't stop that process, because it would just look bad if you were to, you know, contact the reviewers and say, hey, you know, the author submitted a new version of the paper. Can you look at this one instead? I mean, it just seems, it's very unprofessional, and it's not going to do the author any favors. So I've actually never heard of that happening. Like I said, I wasn't even sure how the system could take another paper. But anyway, so yeah, no. Other problems that you might have, if you've really tried and you can't get 2 reviewers, you can provide a review yourself. I've had a couple editors do that. I tend to I tend not to do that. I tend to, you know, try to find somebody to review, but I've got a couple editors who work under me who, you know, they feel it's easier to just write the review themselves than keep nagging people to try and find someone to do a review. So it's sort of a personal thing. Reviewers take so long, you know, we already talked about having to nag them in a nice way, and more so than nice, just in a constructive way. You want to find some kind of wording that might prompt them, guilt them into doing that review. Authors don't submit a detailed response to reviewers and track changes manuscript, and then just tell them to do it. Tell them you're not gonna, you know, evaluate, they're not gonna review the revision until you submit what you've asked for. Sometimes if a review's taking a long time, authors might contact you and just say, hey, what's up? And, you know, usually I'll say, oh, you know, I've got one review in, but the other one, you know, is taking a long time. So I try to give them, you know, an update, but I'm not going to give any indication of, you know, oh, I think it's going to be accepted. You know, I mean, you don't want to ever say anything like that. And if the review does take really long, I mean, I've apologized to authors, you know, for really long reviews, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't affect my decision. I'll just, you know, try and be nice and say, you know, I understand it took a really long time and I'm sorry. Oh, so this was just in case anybody wanted to come for our lab meeting next week. We're going to be going over Sam's paper, the paper that Sam is on DNA integrity in forensic samples. So we're going to, you know, everybody's going to read the paper and any reviews. And I think you said you were going to do a review so we can, you know, in real time talk about, you know, how the reviews ought to be handled and how the final recommendation ought to be made. Okay, so now on to publishing. As grad students, how should we prioritize our time? How many publications should grad students try to have by the time they graduate? So, so these are recommendations that I try to tell all my students. Be aware of how you spend your time. You know, if you really don't know where the day goes, if you don't know what hours you actually spent doing research or writing or TAing or taking classes, it's likely that you don't have very good control over your time and you're not doing the things that you need to be doing. So I think, you know, at least in the beginning, having goals that you set maybe every week, month, semester, year, whatever works best for you to keep you on track so that you feel like you're accomplishing the things you want to accomplish. Now that assumes you know what it is you want to be accomplishing. But if you have a sense that, you know, you're not getting done what you think you need to be, then I think goal setting can be really good to keep you on track. You know, that it gets you good at thinking about, well, what can I accomplish in a week? And maybe in the beginning, you're like wildly off, you know, but then it helps you figure out how to set good, reasonable goals. And I think you should have several timelines. That's why I say week, month, semester, yearly, whatever works for you, but a couple of different timelines to kind of keep you on track. And as grad students, your research always has to come first. I mean, it's why you're in grad school. So everything else should be backburnered. You know, TAing, taking classes, conferences, any kind of service, none of that's going to get you hired at the end of the day, right? You've got a PhD, you want to get a job that requires a PhD, and for the most part, you know, coming from a Research One university, they're expecting you to have done research. So that's where your time should be spent. You know, how many publications should you have by the time you graduate? You know, 3 is kind of a good but minimum. I will tell you that, you know, when we look at packages for people applying for assistant professor positions here, the ones who make it to the, you know, the list where, you know, it's projected on the screen and the whole department faculty are talking about these people, you know, I mean, they've got 10 publications and grants and, you know, maybe a book contract. So one of our most recent hires, Kim Valenta, who came in as an assistant professor, I'm pretty sure Kim had over 30 publications. So, you know, unfortunately, that's who you're going to be up against. And when we discuss, so when we have a search, right, and you know, we get all the applications, and then there's a search committee, and the search committee goes through all of them and comes up with this long list of faculty that then get discussed at a departmental meeting. And so it's then put in a spreadsheet. And so, you know, all the pages of your application get reduced to one line on an Excel spreadsheet. And that line is going to include when you got your PhD, because we want to know how many years you've been out, how many publications you've got, if you've got a book, how many grants you've got, and what courses you've taught. And, you know, and there'll be something about what kind of research you do, but at that point, your research will have been evaluated so to make sure that it fits with what the position is, you know, being advertised for. But, you know, so when you picture that one line of an Excel spreadsheet, you got to have bigger numbers than everybody else, right? I mean, that's the only way that everybody in the faculty is going to say, yeah, we want to bring that person in for an interview. So it really does become, now if someone's got, you know, a science or nature paper, you know, that might get highlighted. If it's a really big NIH or NSF grant, you know, that might get highlighted. But otherwise, it's pretty much just going to be numbers. So any more questions on that, which kind of gets into a different thing? How do you get hired and what do you need to get hired? But obviously that's part of the how many publications do you need to have question. Okay. What should an author do if they don't agree with a reviewer comment? So I tell my students, you respond to everything in a review, even the good stuff, because then you get to highlight that the reviewer said good stuff about you, but you cut and paste the entire review, even the stuff that summarizes your paper, because as an editor, I want to make sure that the authors have responded to absolutely everything, that they haven't cut and pasted just parts of it. And once I see, and if I see that they've cut and pasted parts of it, then it makes my job harder, because now I've got to have multiple screens, right? I've got to have the review up. I've got to have the author's response to it, and I've got to be going back and forth and say, yeah, they cut and pasted this part, but they didn't cut and paste that part. So that's why I say just you cut and paste the entire review and you respond to all of it. Now, reviewer comments that you don't agree with, you know, you can say stuff like, this is a great idea and we're working on it. That's going to be our next paper. You know, I mean, you try to spin everything as positively as you can. Or sometimes, you know, you might have to say, we didn't have funding to collect additional samples or additional data, you know, but we think that our results, you know, are really supported by the data set we have. And you basically want to try to address as much of the reviewer's comment as you can. So even though I said that you want to cut and paste the entire review, there's a little bit of, you know, judgment calls in what chunk of text you cut out, right? So you can cut out a big chunk of text from a review that you then cut and paste. And maybe in that chunk of text, there are actually like 5 things that you could do. And you're not going to do them all, but you can kind of hide it a bit because maybe you do 3 of them, right? So then if you've got that whole chunk of text and you can say, you know, we did this and we did that, and, you know, then maybe the 2 you don't do get kind of lost and you don't have to explicitly respond to them. But that's only if it works that you've got this big chunk of text where the reviewer is going, you know, have you thought about this? Or what about this other thing? I really think you ought to, you know, if there are a lot of comments like that, you don't necessarily have to respond to every one, but you've got to have that whole chunk of text that you respond to at least some of it. You don't want to say anything that's going to piss off the reviewer because there's a good chance your paper will go back to that reviewer. So you don't want to ever say, you know, the reviewer has clearly misunderstood what we did here. I mean, there's no point in ever saying anything like that. You know, you just find a nice way. I mean, certainly there are times you've gotten reviews where, you know, the reviewer didn't understand what you were doing. And, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, maybe they didn't see something that you did. But that's legitimate because maybe you didn't make it obvious enough. You know, they shouldn't have to read your paper in gory detail to find everything. Maybe you should make it a little more obvious, in which case you say, oh, you know, we did that, but, you know, we now mention it, you know, at the beginning of the method so that it's clearer, something like that. Does that cover this issue enough?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do if you have conflicting like comments from reviewers? Like one reviewer says you should do this and one reviewer says to do like something completely opposite of it, right? Like how do you reconcile those issues?
I mean, I don't know that I've often had reviewers recommending things that are directly opposed. I mean, they might recommend two different things, but they're not contradictory. I don't think I've had.
Okay, I didn't know if it was
Like,
ever a thing. No, I haven't had it happen, but I was just thinking about like, you know, what do you do if like they give you two different options to fix a problem, like a common problem that they see, but maybe it just doesn't happen. I don't know.
It really doesn't tend to happen like that.
Okay.
You know, they tend to just, you know, one reviewer might recommend one thing and another reviewer might recommend another thing. Maybe if they're both intended to address the same problem, you could then say, you know, we chose to, you know, both reviewers brought up this issue. They suggested different ways to deal with it. Ultimately, we decided to go with this option. You know, you could say something like that. Oftentimes, so I tend to write really long and really detailed response to reviewer letters. And so oftentimes I end up repeating myself because different reviewers will bring up the same point. And so then I'll say, you know, see point above, so that it's clear, you know, that I've addressed it before. But I'll usually still cut and paste the whole thing so that the editor doesn't have to go back and find that comment. You know, so you always want to make it as easy as possible for the editor to say, oh yeah, she's addressed all these issues. I don't need to send it out for review again. I'm just going to accept it.
Okay. Well, so I can think of one case in which I've got actual reviews back as an editor side of things where one says, I love the images, and one says the images suck or the tables suck. So then it's like, well, what do you do if one reviewer is like, oh no, these tables are really effective and do exactly what they need, and the other one says like they need a complete overhaul.
Huh, and so what did you think as the editor?
They're typical archaeology tables, so like they're the classic present absent tables, so I don't know what the issue is, but
so then I think I'd probably say that, you know,
okay.
you don't necessarily have to say one reviewer, you know, likes the images and the other one doesn't. You could just say, I find the images to be fine. I don't think, you know, anything needs to be changed.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what can early career authors do to get more views or readership for their work? So I'm not used to this at all, trying to, you know, drum up business for my work. I don't do anything on social media. You know, I'm sort of dinosaur-like that. I don't know what I would do. I don't know how much on social media would help. Ultimately, you want your paper cited, right? So it's the number of citations, it's the impact factor of the journal that you know matters. I don't know that social media can do anything to help that. So that's one reason I don't do anything with social media. The other reason is I don't know how to. But what I do is if we're publishing a paper that I think could get some good press, I will then contact UF's publicity people, because their job is to advertise what UF is doing, right? So you know, they've got some sort of background in communications or journalism, and their job is to put out press releases. So, you know, I'll contact them. And so I've listed some of the people. I've worked with the UF communications people, Steve Orlando and Allison Clark. I haven't worked with the people at class. But they're very good at this, you know. Steve Orlando set up an interview for me to do on one of our discrimination papers. I mean, once, you know, so what I do is I contact them and say, you know, we've got a paper that was just accepted at PLOS One or something, you know, here's a brief description, you know, could you write a press release? And they decide if they think it's a hot enough topic. And part of it is based on what you send them. So you've got to make it, you don't want to send them the abstract of your paper, because now you've got a different audience, right? Now you want to talk to the people who want to, you know, maybe put it on one of the marquees at UF, or, you know, in the Alligator, or, you know, something like that. So you've got to change what it does. So I had one grad student who had studied blood pressure in our population of African Americans in Tallahassee. And what she had found doing network analysis was that the people who had more family members in their network tended to have higher blood pressure. So I had this title, oh God, I forget what it was, but at the time I was trying to be, you know, creative, that, you know, family does make your blood boil, you know, something like that, right? Because I was trying to, you know, catch their eye so that they could then write a press release that would catch other people's eyes. Now, I talked to this some with Chris McCarty, and Chris said, yeah, he just writes his own press releases now. You know, he got frustrated with, you know, the back and forth, or, you know, them putting a bad title or something. And that's what happened with Kia's paper on the blood pressure. They ultimately put a title on it that was factually inaccurate. And so Chris said, yeah, he writes his own press releases now. He sends them to the publicity people because they're the ones who need to put it out, but he just writes his own press release. And I'm like, wow, okay. I kind of thought that was their job, not my job, but I get his point. So that's the way that, you know, I advertise stuff that comes out of our lab, and I honestly don't know how good a job I think it does. So we had a lot of publicity on this paper that Jackie Quinlan put out a number of years ago, and it never got very well cited. And it's only within the past year that all of a sudden the citations are going up. And I really don't know what happened. I assume it got cited in a paper that got read a lot, and now all of a sudden people are citing it. But I don't feel like I have much control over it, other than, you know, citing your own stuff, right? Does that help?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't, honestly, I didn't even realize that UF had a communications like department that you could even sense. I mean, it makes sense. I don't know why I didn't like think about it, but that's actually pretty useful. I think it might be nice at some point to also have, because I know they've done several workshops, like other, like, I don't want to say journals, but other like societies have done workshops recently about how to use like social media and things like that in general. And so I don't know if there's somebody who specializes in that on campus that could, I mean, I'm sure there is, like, there has to be somebody who that's their, you know, part of what they do. But
I mean, you could ask the class guys, Scott and Andrew, because I would say they would be a good place to start.
mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, their job is to advertise the you know, most interesting stuff going on at UF, and you know, they're only gonna, I mean, we make their job easier if we bring them interesting stuff. Now, maybe what's interesting to us isn't interesting to them, but you know, it's always worth trying. I will say I've never had them turn me down. You know, they've never said, oh, that's really not worth a press release, Connie. I don't know what you were thinking. But they do different degrees of effort. Like the one paper, Steve organized this whole, you know, radio interview. That's only happened once, you know, so, but I think, you know, at least putting out a press release, or, you know, we've gotten a couple things in the Alligator, but I think that was because of the press release that UF put out.
Okay.
Okay, so those are all the questions that people put to me. These last couple slides, I think I've got like 5 or 6 slides just on, you know, how to, you know, publish your article, not the writing part of it, but how to go through the publication process. Are you guys interested in me covering this? Andrew, Edward, you actually saw it, because this is part of what I talked about when we were in Congo last summer. But anyway, I tweaked it a tiny bit. So the first thing you want to do is pick the right journal, right? You want to make sure you've got a good fit with whatever journal you submit to. Sometimes it's obvious who to submit to. Sometimes it's not, right? Generally with our stuff, you know, we kind of want to try and aim a little higher, you know, than maybe where we end up. The stuff my lab does isn't very scoopable. So nobody has the data sets we have. So we're not really worried that if we don't get something out right away, someone's gonna, scoop us and publish something identical to it. So it means we've got a little bit of extra time to say, what the hell, let's try for, PNAS or science or something like that. Those journals tend to reject really fast. I mean, literally like the same day sometimes. So you're not wasting a lot of time if you go and try for that, and you miss 100% of the hits you don't take, right? So sometimes it's worth just getting a little of experience with that. But ultimately you do want to make sure you've got a good fit with what the journal publishes. So the best way to figure that out is read through, some tables of contents and see what kind of stuff they're publishing. And if you look at that and you're like, oh, this looks really foreign, I mean, that probably means the journal's not a very good fit. So the journals I've published in, I'm not happy, but I've had a few, but not as many as I would have liked in journals like PNAS and Science and Nature. Most of our stuff comes out in AJPA and PLOS One. I found PLOS One to be really good because it's very broad, right? So a lot of what we do is very interdisciplinary. So I like that it gets a very broad audience. So that's, I would say the majority of our stuff has gone into PLOS One lately. Then some of these other journals are ones we published in there that I said are more collaborations, where they end up going for very specific journals. And that's just like I said, I tend to avoid the really specific stuff because I like the broader audience we get with PLOS One. Predatory journals have become so common, and it's really difficult to know what a predatory journal is these days, particularly if you're a grad student, thinking about publishing something, maybe as a solo author or something like that. The journals have gotten so good at making the titles really close to the title of a real journal. They've fixed the grammar on a lot of their web pages and emails so that that's not as big a red flag as it used to be. Basically, you want to see if it's, for us, most of the journals we publish in are indexed on PubMed or Google Scholar. You want to see if the journal shows up on those sorts of websites, because otherwise when you publish something, it's not going to come up. Now that said, I've certainly published in journals that don't come up on PubMed. I think Annual Review of Anthropology is something that doesn't come up on PubMed, but I still, am very happy with the paper I published there. So looking at places like PubMed and Google Scholar isn't, a perfect criterion, but it's something. Pretty much any journal sending you an email asking you to publish with them is a red flag, especially since you're more junior now. So it's unlikely that they're going to be saying, oh, because of your illustrious research program and history of publishing, I mean, it's unlikely. So you can pretty much say if they're seeking you out, that is not a journal you want to publish in. Some journals charge you money just to submit a paper, right? So it's certainly typical to be charged to publish a paper. Some journals will charge you even to submit a paper. Now that said, there was one legitimate journal we submitted to where they charged us to submit. I was sort of taken aback. We paid, they rejected it. Wasn't a good experience. There's no ironclad criterion on how to identify predatory journals, but you just want to be aware that they're out there. And if you've got any concerns, start talking to people, find out if anybody's heard of this journal. So when you submit your journal, read all of the instructions to the authors. It's really irritating to get a paper where the authors have clearly just recycled it from some other journal and they haven't paid attention to the rules for the journal that they've now submitted to. So go through all the instructions to authors, and make sure that, you know, that there are no grammatical or typographical errors, because reviewers will always look at those kind of errors as an indication of how careful you were with your research. So it's not just, oh, you know, a bunch of typos, but it's like, well, the typos are the obvious things that I can see. But what sort of laziness or slackness did you have in your research that I can't necessarily see, but now, you know, my guard is up because I see you can't even fix typos in a paper. So you want to make sure that that's all really careful. I was talking to Trudy Turner, the editor of AJPA, last night, because a paper was just submitted that, you know, we weren't really happy with, and they had one figure in the paper that they you know, cite in the paper, and they forgot to submit it. I'm like, so are you going to be appropriately embarrassed if I come back to you and say, you know, I think you forgot something? Because you ought to be. I mean, this is your paper. You ought to be covering all aspects of it. You want to write a cover letter. You really want to make the case. You know, don't just copy and paste the abstract. You know, write a paragraph about why your paper is interesting and why the journal ought to be interested in it. And usually I like to cite a couple of related articles that journal has published to make the case that this is the place for my article. You always want to suggest reviewers. You know, they've even done studies to show that papers have a higher acceptance rate if you suggest reviewers. And like I said, as an editor, I always pick one reviewer from the list that the authors suggest, and then one from a list I come up with. Like I said, we've published a lot in PLOS One. And I think I've already kind of gone through responding to reviews, really detailed response to reviewers letter, submit a track change and clean copy of the revised manuscript. And I think I've just got 2 more slides. So this is part of a response to reviewer letter that we wrote for, I think this was Chris's MAOA paper. So this part here is the boilerplate that I sent to the editor. We've revised our manuscript to address all editor and reviewer comments. We've reformatted according to requirements. Our point-by-point responses are bolded below. You always want to make it, here I just underlined it, but you want to make it clear what the response is and what the reviewer comment was. We provide a marked up copy and a clean copy, and then I always say, we believe we have addressed all of the issues and hope you agree that the manuscript is now ready for publication. So then this was one of the first reviewers' comments in the study. The authors investigate the effects of MAOA on psychosocial stress, although the sample size is limited, the longitudinal design. And so it's just kind of, you know, describing it. But I said, like I said, I cut and paste everything, and then I just say, thank you, you've described our paper perfectly, you know, because it's nice to have some positive things in there. Then the next one, I have 2 minor comments. I think the last 2 paragraphs can be removed, you know, so I just say done. Then here, although the authors provide limitations of the study, they should include, you know, the following about population structure and lack of correction for population structure. Well, actually, we had corrected for population structure, but clearly that information didn't come across clearly enough. So we just said study site was controlled for in order to control for population structure. So, you know, we had said it was study site, but we didn't make it clear that in controlling for study site, we were in fact controlling for population structure. And we then say this information was added to the methods. I give the exact lines of the manuscript, and then I repeat the exact quote so that now the editor doesn't have to go back and have another screen open with the PDF of my manuscript to make sure that I really said this, or that to make sure that I really, you know, did say study site controls for population structure, but they can look here at the quote and say, yeah, okay, that's good. That addresses my comment. And then here they say that the reviewer says in the discussion section, the authors do not discuss their finding of no association between trauma and psychosocial stress. I believe this can be expanded on. So we say, The association between trauma and psychosocial stress is complicated, which it was, and it's not something we fully investigate since our focus was on the effect of the gene. So that's how we dealt with, you know, a comment that, you know, we really weren't going to do anything about, just pointing out that it was really outside the scope of the paper since we were really focused on the effect of this one gene. And the paper was accepted, so, you know, it was fine. Okay, so that's all I had prepared. And how long did we go? So that's just about an hour, right? Was that an hour? Yeah. So anybody got any more questions?
Not that I can think of right off the bat. That was a lot of really good information, though. I'm like pretty stoked on this, actually, especially because we have the slides too, so we can keep like referencing, which is nice.
Yeah, good.
I have a question. So when you look at sort of all the papers you've ever submitted and think about how many of them have been accepted, like what would you estimate that percentage to be?
I'm pretty stubborn. I think I only got one or two papers that I have, maybe just one paper that I gave up on and said, oh, this is never going to be published. I mean, if you're persistent enough, you'll find a journal. There was one paper when we did the work in Yemen. So Ali Almiri, my collaborator there, was, I mean, he was amazing. He did so much work to ensure that we got 550 samples, which really, I mean, to me, it sort of solidified my position at UF. That Yemeni project sort of then laid the groundwork that I felt like I had enough momentum that, you know, we could keep going and I wasn't really worried about running out of stuff to do. So I really felt like I owed Ali a lot. And he had said that he really needed a first author paper. And it was clear he wasn't going to write it because he was, I mean, he was as much of a geneticist as Sinai University got, but he really wasn't a geneticist. And he certainly wasn't going to generate data or do analyses or write a paper. So it was awkward because, you know, if I had a student do that kind of stuff, then they would be first author. So I had to find a project where, you know, nobody else was owed first authorship, because I was willing to write it and give first authorship to Ali. But I had to find a data set that, you know, essentially the data set I found was a data set that had been put together by enough different undergrads that nobody was really owed first authorship on it. And so I could then put it together as a paper that I could put Ali on for first author. But then it was a matter of finding a journal, right? Because it wasn't a very good paper. And so that was the only time I published in mitochondrial DNA. So there are just a lot of journals out there that, Drew Kitchen had a paper that actually is now very highly cited, doing a phylogenetic analysis on lexical data from Semitic languages. I think he submitted, God, I want to say he submitted to 4 different journals before he got it accepted. But during that whole time, he was adding more data. So he was adding more languages and he was adding more words in the languages. And you know, he had the analysis down. So he just kept redoing the analysis. And so, like I said, it was ultimately accepted and now it's very highly cited. So you just kind of don't give up. I guess, you know, and I guess I would say, so Drew actually represents the extreme of how long has it taken you to publish a paper. But like I said, the paper evolved significantly over that time. The paper that went through 4 revisions in one journal, the paper really didn't change in that time. You know, that was just, I think if the reviews had been better responded to in the first time, it could easily have just been 2 rounds of reviews.
I have a question about, because you brought up, you know, sending like a cover letter when you submit an article to be published. Is that, I don't want to say sub like more common in one subfield versus another, but is it something that's like fairly common for most journals to submit a cover letter, like like a required part of their submission, or is it just something that you should do just to be like helpful and useful as an author, like to make the editor's job easier?
You know, it's interesting, Megan, because we always write cover letters when we submit articles, but as an associate editor, I never read cover letters.
Okay.
I mean, you know, and it was many, many years before I realized that apparent contradiction. It's just as an AE, I mean, the first thing I do when I get a new paper is I pull up a PDF of the paper. I honestly don't know. I don't know if that means I'm going to stop writing cover letters, because there could easily be editors out there who do read cover letters. Just because I don't read them doesn't mean nobody does. I do think it's a good exercise to write a cover letter, because it's kind of more press releasey like, you know, because you, like I said, you don't take the abstract because that's too jargony. That's for a very specific audience, whereas the cover letter ought to be more why your stuff is so cool, right? So I think it's a good exercise to take your stuff and then word it slightly differently. You get in a different mindset when you're trying to sell it at that level to a journal editor who you know might not be a geneticist like myself. So I've got to explain why my genetic data are so interesting that you ought to publish this paper. So I guess I still think it's a really good exercise, even if the editor doesn't read it.
Okay. It's good to know.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully this helped, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah,
very
that's
helpful.
great. Thank you.
Helpful.
All right. See you guys later.